Hello, and welcome to Recycling 101, a Northeast Resource Recovery Association presentation. My name's Andrea Folsom. I'm the Communications Manager here at NRRA, and I'll be your presenter today. A little bit about what we're going to talk about. We'll start with a tiny bit about NRRA and our impact, and move on then to solid waste in New Hampshire, recycling in New Hampshire, then look closer at recycling in your town, recycling by type, and finally, next steps that you can take to make a difference. NRRA is the oldest and largest cooperative model recycling nonprofit in the country. Our mission is to partner with members to make recycling strong through economic and environmentally sound solutions. We mainly support small rural communities in New Hampshire, as well as Vermont, Connecticut, and Massachusetts with cooperative marketing, education, and technical assistance. In fiscal year 2022, we returned nearly $3 million to our members thanks to recycling. We did that by helping our members manage over 81.5 million pounds of solid waste. Thanks to recycling, over 207 million pounds of carbon dioxide emissions were averted. That's like removing over 20,000 passenger cars from the road for a full year. Let's start with trash, a nationwide look. This is the amount of national municipal solid waste generated by material based on weight. Some highlights. Food waste is the heaviest, followed by plastic and paper. 34% could be composted, such as food waste and yard trimmings. A note to folks living in New Hampshire, yard trimmings are actually banned from being landfilled. Additionally, 48% of waste could theoretically be recycled. Here's another way to look at things. When we look at what happens to your trash, and again, this is a nationwide look, we can see that paper recycling is doing okay. The red on the bottom shows the amount that is landfilled or sent to waste to energy plants, and the light green on top is the amount that's recycled. On the other hand, you can see that we need to continue to improve glass, metal, and plastic recycling, as the red far outweighs the green. There's also a need to continue to improve food waste diversion, though you can see that composting of both food waste and yard trimming does happen. Now let's look at solid waste in New Hampshire and New Hampshire's current infrastructure. New Hampshire has 6 landfills. 3 are public and 3 are private or limited service area landfills. The 3 public landfills include Mount Carberry in Success, New Hampshire, the North Country Environmental Services in Bethlehem, and the Waste Management Turnkey in Rochester. The 3 limited service areas include Conway, Lebanon, and Nashua. You'll see that we have 1 waste to energy incinerator, which is the Wheelabrator in Concord, but we have no MRFs or materials recovery facilities. A MRF mechanically separates single stream or zero sort recyclables. We also have no anaerobic digesters, which are used to help with composting. What does this mean? Well, if you live in a community with single stream recycling, that means that all single stream recycling must be sent out of state to be processed. Here's a question for you. How much waste disposed of in New Hampshire actually comes from out of state? I'll give you a moment to think. If you guessed 50%, you're right. The majority of out of state waste comes from Massachusetts. However, it should be noted that New Hampshire does send some of its own solid waste over the border, especially from towns that border Vermont. So, what about recycling? Again, this is a statewide look at New Hampshire. Here's another great thing to think about. What kind of recycling does your community have? Do you have single stream where all of your recyclables go into one bin and are separated after collection? Do you have dual stream where all of your glass and plastic and metals are put into one bin while your paper and cardboard go into another? And then again, they are further separated after collection? Or do you have source separated recycling where you must separate your own recyclables prior to them being collected? or most commonly at a drop off center, such as a transfer station. There are pros and cons for both source separated and single or dual stream recycling. For source separated recycling, materials are generally higher in quality and value because there's less contamination. However, on the flip side, it does require more effort by residents to either leave sorted items at your curb or take them to a recycling center. For single or dual stream recycling, the pro is that it's more convenient because all recyclables go into one or two containers. However, on the flip side, the quality of the material may be degraded due to contamination, resulting in materials being sent to landfills. We are also often asked, is my recycling really being recycled or is it just being trashed? This is a great question. This is something we more often hear from communities with single stream recycling, where all recyclables are put together into the same bin and hauled away to a magic recycling facility. The short answer is yes. The vast majority of your recycling is being recycled. There will, of course, be cases where recycling contamination creeps in and ruins a small percentage of the recyclable material. But again, the majority of recyclables sent to a transfer station or recycling center are recycled. If you think about it strictly from a money making perspective, it's easy to see why recycling the recyclables versus landfilling or incinerating them makes sense. It costs money to build, run, and maintain a transfer station or recycling center. From staffing to building and grounds to the machinery required, recycling centers need to make a revenue to support themselves, just like any other manufacturer. Communities want to be sure as much as being recycled as possible so they can avoid landfilling or incineration costs. So here's another great question for you. What percentage of communities in New Hampshire have their own municipal recycling facility? 72%, 85%, 91%? Take a moment to think. If you guessed 85%, you're right. State law in New Hampshire requires that each town shall either provide a facility or assure access to another approved solid waste facility for its residents. That's why, no matter how big or small the town, you'll find transfer stations and recycling centers all across New Hampshire. When we think about recycling processing, oftentimes folks believe that all recycling processing goes out of state. While that's mainly true because of things like aluminum, which needs to be smelted in order to be recycled, other things are recycled and processed within the state. For example, electronics are sorted, dismantled, and mechanically separated right here in Dover, New Hampshire. In addition, cardboard is processed in Claremont, New Hampshire, made into sheets of craft paper for brown paper bags, lawn bags, and packing materials. It doesn't always go out of state. Thinking about becoming a solid waste operator in New Hampshire? Well, that's going to require a certification. Since 1988, New Hampshire state law has required persons who operate solid waste facilities to be trained and certified by the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. There are currently over 1,400 certified solid waste operators in New Hampshire. Operators that understand the requirements are in a better position to properly maintain their facility, control operating costs, and protect public health and the environment. In addition to certified solid waste operators, solid waste management facilities must be permitted, including the specific type of waste they are allowed to accept. The solid waste permitting system provides regulatory controls to assure proper construction, operation, and closure of solid waste facilities, which protects the environment, public health, and safety. Approvals are also required for certain solid waste management related activities, including the production and use of waste derived products. Solid waste operator training increases awareness of and compliance with RSA 149 M and the New Hampshire solid waste rules through education and training. Now let's take a closer look at recycling in your town. Here are a list of some of the town departments you can find in most towns. Take a moment to think, Which of the following departments generate revenue? You can see that the transfer station is one of a few departments that brings in revenue, and the only department that brings in revenue through the sale of recyclables. Revenue is the total amount of money generated by the sale of goods or services, while income is earnings or profit, revenue minus expenses. Like money, try recycling. When you recycle, revenue is earned and disposal costs are avoided. Disposal costs are how much it costs for waste to be landfilled or incinerated. Waste diversion can help avoid the higher cost of municipal solid waste disposal, though this is not always true with single and dual stream recycling when markets are down. The cost of landfilling and incineration will continue to rise, so diversion is key. For example, typically the cost to recycle is less than the cost to throw that material away. Waste may cost $100 a ton to landfill or incinerate. A recyclable may sell for $140 a ton revenue. So if you recycle it, you would both get the $140 for the sale of the recyclable plus $100 to avoid landfilling. So now that recyclable is worth $240 by combining both revenue and the avoided disposal costs. Here's one of my very favorite recycling examples because it really takes the environmental and economic perspectives into one example. In addition to saving money or generating revenue, waste diversion saves energy and natural resources. A great example of that is the aluminum can. First, it saves money. It's cheaper to recycle aluminum versus extracting new aluminum through mining and processing ore. It saves energy. Recycling aluminum saves more than 90% of the energy needed to create new aluminum. And it saves natural resources. Nearly 75% of all aluminum ever produced is still in use today. The other important thing to note about recycling is it helps to save valuable landfill capacity for waste that cannot be diverted or recycled. So, you might be asking yourself, why doesn't my town recycle everything? Well, just because it's recyclable doesn't mean it's processable. You need three things to decide. First, the amount. We're looking for an economy of scale. If you don't have enough of a thing to recycle, it may not be worth it in the end, meaning the price might be just too high for the little amount that you have. Remember, when you are recycling, though you are receiving revenue in most cases from the sale of the item, you still have the costs associated with labor and transport. The second thing you need to consider is location. Where are the recyclables located and where do they need to go in order to be processed? As I mentioned, transportation costs can be a good part of the cost of recyclables. And these costs will be taken against any revenue that you may make. So it's always an important question to ask. Is my recyclable going to be shipped somewhere close to me? Will I be able to save on transportation costs? Or in order to recycle this material, would I need to send it so far away that the transportation costs, and this includes the environmental costs of the CO2 generated by transportation, outweigh the benefits of recycling? Finally, there's the cost or revenue of the materials. Recycling markets are just like any other market, they go up and they go down. So it's important to look at both the market and the quality of your materials that you'll be offering. If the market is doing really well and you have clean, non contaminated materials, then great. If you have enough of them and the location is pretty close, you're going to get a good amount of money for those recyclables. But when the markets are down, it can mean a very different story. And the cost to recycle may end up being more than the cost to landfill or incinerate. These are some of the tough choices towns and municipalities must make when deciding whether or not to provide recycling in their community. I just wanted to stop and make a note on contamination. As you may have noticed, recycling is a manufacturing process. Machinery is used to create new items on a large scale. So, just as you wouldn't want contamination in consumable items you use daily, you don't want contamination in the raw materials being recycled back into a usable item. Contamination tends to be much lower in source separated recyclables, opposed to single or dual stream recyclables. Now let's take an even closer look at the types of recycling. First, I want you to ask yourself, when do you think recycling happens? Is it when you throw an empty can into the recycling bin? When a plastic bottle is turned into a shirt? Maybe it's when recyclables are dropped off at the transfer station, or when containers are baled and shipped to a processing plant? Well, if you guessed when the item is turned back into a new item, you're right. Recycling is a circle, a loop, and it doesn't happen when items are just tossed into the recycling bin. It happens when materials are recycled and turned back into new materials or products that people use. So, remember, it's important to close that recycling loop. If you're not buying recycled, then you aren't fully recycling. So before you buy, look for the words post consumer recycled content. That means that the materials used to make that new thing you're buying used to be another thing that other people in a community used and then chose to recycle. You can also look for the words recycled content. That's still a good thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that anybody else used it. For example, oftentimes when newspaper is being made, they need to cut off the ends to make it a rectangle. They then clean up all those cut ends of paper and they recycle it back into new newsprint. So that's how your newspaper could be made with recycled content, but not necessarily content that ever went out into the world. Now let's look at what exactly things get recycled into. So, if you're looking at magazines, they can be recycled into paperboard, telephone directories, if anyone's still using them, and newspaper. Products like paperboard, mixed paper, and junk mail can be recycled into paper backing found on roofing shingles, or paper towel and toilet paper, or new paperboard packaging. Cardboard can become paper bags, new cardboard, paperboard, or cardboard medium, which is a corrugated middle part. Notebook and computer paper can be recycled into paper towels, facial tissue like Kleenex, toilet paper, napkins, or into new notebook or computer paper. Tin or steel cans can be recycled into bike parts or rebar. It can become car parts or steel beams, appliances, and of course, new cans. Aluminum, most often, is recycled back into new aluminum cans. Glass can become new glass bottles or jars. It can become fiberglass or sand used in construction projects called PGA or processed glass aggregate. Plastics can become all sorts of things, including carpet, backpacks, polar fleece, sleeping bag and ski jacket insulation, plastic lumber for decking, docks, and furniture, play sets, new plastic bottles, buckets or containers, frisbees, or even stadium seats. So, a quick note on recycling plastic in particular, since we often hear lots of questions related to this. You've probably seen the symbol right there on your screen of the three arrows. This is also known as chasing arrows, and you'll find it on all sorts of plastic things. You might mean that it means that something is definitely recyclable or that it's maybe made from recyclable materials. Unfortunately, it's never that straightforward. This symbol with a number in the middle tells you what type of resin or plastic the item is predominantly made out of. This means it can give you a clue as to whether or not it's recyclable. Some numbers, like number 1 and number 2, are often recyclable, especially when it's a bottle, jug, or tub. Other numbers, like number 6, such as styrofoam cups, or number 7, which is a catch all other plastic and can include things like cell phone cases, are very difficult to process and therefore are rarely accepted. So, here's a quick guide to plastic recycling numbers. Yes, recycle number one and number two plastics, such as soda and water bottles, milk and juice jugs, shampoo, and cleaning bottles. Just a note here, if the cleaning bottle had hazardous waste in it of any kind, such as a noxious chemical, then those should be set aside to be processed with your hazardous waste materials unless they're very well cleaned out. On the next line, toss it. Number three, which is PVC pipes. Number six, which is styrofoam. And number seven, which is just a catch all for either other plastics or plastic that might be made up of a variety of resins. And this can include things like plastic food trays, cooking oil containers, vending cups, vinyl, and most styrofoam products. You're going to want to toss those. Finally, number four and number five plastic. So these are things like yogurt containers are often number five plastics, or shopping and dry cleaning bags, things that are stretchy. Some communities do recycle these things. Generally speaking, you should never throw any kind of stretchy plastic bag in with your single stream recycling because they can get tangled in the machinery. However, there are drop off locations at most big box stores or grocery stores to take back those single use, clean, dry, stretchy bags to be recycled. They are often turned back into plastic lumber. And number five plastics, such as yogurt containers, while the market for these is actually really good, oftentimes they can be recycled. So it's important just to ask. So, as a final reminder, when in doubt, throw it out. It's better to throw something out than contaminating a full recycling load. If it's a number one, but not a bottle, tub, or jug, you need to ask before you recycle. For example, those sneaky clamshell food containers that you find strawberries or salad in are often not recyclable, even though they're number one. Three, decreasing the amount of single use plastic you'll use will always be better than recycling. First, reduce and refuse, then reuse, and final option is to recycle. One more note on plastic recycling. There was a recent Greenpeace article that stated that only 5 to 6% of plastic is recycled. However, that actually includes all plastics that are created. So, plastic that you might find on furniture, or plastic that you find in a hospital, plastics that are found in electronic devices. Plastic really is everywhere in our life. But when we look at plastic recycling rates for bottles, tubs, and jugs, it's nearly 30%, according to the most recent EPA numbers. So, still far less than what we would like, but better than the 5 to 6% the Greenpeace article mentioned. Even though we're always aiming for more, it's still always a great thing to recycle your number one and number two plastics when you can. You might have heard that styrofoam is recyclable and wonder why you can't put it in with your recycling. Styrofoam is made up mostly of air with only 5% polystyrene. It's really hard to process. It's expensive to store and ship because it takes a lot of it in order to create a ton since it's so light. And oftentimes it's a common single stream contaminant. Now, a few communities in New Hampshire and Vermont have started recycling styrofoam. A machine at the transfer station breaks down the styrofoam before melting it into a tube that's shaped into a 50-pound block. You can find this currently in Guilford, New Hampshire, and at the Lyndonville Recycling Center in Vermont. When it comes to plastic bags, I mentioned that you should never throw these in with your single stream recycling because they are a real tangler and they can jam up processing equipment. When that processing equipment is jammed up, a human has to go in to cut it all out, which is a really dangerous job. However, you can take clean and dry plastic bags, something stretchy, and you can return them to a grocery store or other large store like Target or Walmart near you. Okay, so we've talked a lot about solid waste in the country and in New Hampshire. We've talked about recycling in your town. We've talked about what recycling can turn into and specifically looking at plastics, but you still might be wondering, what exactly can I do to make a difference? Now we're going to look at some recycling next steps. We have some actions that you can start taking today, and we've listed them in the order of being kind of the easiest to taking up the most time. Not necessarily the hardest, but certainly more comprehensive. So, the first thing you can do is sign up for Full of Scrap. Full of Scrap is NRRA's biweekly newsletter on recycling and waste reduction. We oftentimes have a lot of recycling articles, things that you can do in your community to improve recycling, information for operators, and other important updates and information about solid waste management and recycling in the Northeast. The second thing you can do is buy recycled both at home and at work. Again, you can look for post consumer recycled material to know that your recycling has been turned into a new product. And at work, you can do things like use recycled copy paper, which is a great recycled option. Number three is to divert. So stop throwing away food scraps, find an alternative. This might mean that you compost at home or you find a commercial composter or farm near you where you can bring your food scraps. Remember, food scraps take up nearly 25% of all solid waste by weight. They are heavy. When they break down, they release gases such as methane. There are so many good there are options for them that there is no reason that we should be landfilling food scraps. Finally, unite. Join or form a waste reduction committee in your town. On this note, I should say be mindful to work collaboratively in partnership with your town's waste operators. They are the certified experts in the field. So use them as a resource, work collaboratively with them. A wonderful thing that waste reduction committees can do is provide the ongoing residential education that is a real necessary component to running a successful recycling and waste reduction committee or program within your town. Now, let's take a look at a couple of challenges that are pretty unique to New Hampshire. So, first, solid waste is expensive. Waste reduction, like recycling and composting, is more financially valuable in New Hampshire because New England has the highest cost for trash disposal in the entire country. As we run out of places for our solid waste to go, more and more of it must be transported to other states, oftentimes in the Midwest, to be landfilled. That's really expensive. A second challenge is that we have a bunch of out of state waste coming in. So, nearly 50% of waste disposed in New Hampshire comes from out of state, mostly from Massachusetts. The Interstate Commerce Clause says that goods and services can freely move across state lines. So, we can't just say, no, you can't come in. However, there are some tools that the state could use to decrease the amount of out of state solid waste crossing lines. The third reality is we've had a real lack of state support. We lack the grants, technical assistance, and state level policies that support recycling and solid waste management. This is why the New Hampshire Solid Waste Working Group was such an important creation at the state level. Finally, New Hampshire has a lack of infrastructure. We don't have things such as the materials recovery facilities. We don't have an anaerobic digester. So these are some things that we're still looking at as challenges that need to be tackled. So, what are some solutions to those challenges? These are options that have worked in other states. So, the first is a bottle bill. A bottle bill requires a minimum refundable deposit on beer, soft drinks, and other beverage containers in order to ensure a high rate of recycling or reuse. The deposit refund system was created by the beverage industry as a means of guaranteeing the return of their glass bottles to be washed, refilled, and resold. A second possible solution is extended producer responsibility laws, or EPR. So, EPR is an environmental policy approach in which a producer's responsibility for a product is extended to the post consumer stage of a product's life. That means that the producer is now responsible for the item that they have designed, marketed, and sold once that item is done being used. So they have to deal with it once it becomes trash. EPRs place primary responsibility on the producer or brand owner who makes design and marketing decisions. It also creates a setting for markets to emerge that truly reflect the environmental impacts of a product and to which producers and consumers respond. When an EPR is in place, the responsibility, both physically and or economically, is shifted upstream toward the producer and away from municipalities who have historically shouldered the costs of waste and recycling. Some examples from other states include the Paint Stewardship Program, which ensures leftover paint is properly managed in a manner that is sustainably funded. The Carpet Stewardship Program, which ensures discarded carpet becomes a resource for new products. And the Mattress Stewardship Program, which aims to reduce illegal dumping, increase recycling, and substantially reduce local government costs for end of use management of used mattresses. A final possible solution includes waste bans, which are enacted on the state level, such as New Hampshire's yard waste ban. By cutting down on disposal, waste bans also help states capture valuable resources, save energy, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and lessen reliance on landfills and incinerators. Did you know that there's something more damaging to your community and to your environment than not recycling something? What's worse, you might ask? Throwing something in the recycling bin that is not recyclable. Often referred to as wish cycling or outthrows, these pieces of trash pretending to be recycling can contaminate or ruin an entire load of recyclables. Imagine all that work done by all those people in your town ruined because of trash. Just because something has the chasing arrows symbol on it does not mean the item is recyclable. When you throw something in the recycling bin, it does not magically become recyclable. Instead, you have thrown trash into a recycling bin, contaminating actual recyclable materials. Items you wish cycle can contaminate a load of recyclables or get stuck, tangled, or wrapped in the recycling processing machinery. This can cause expensive and potentially dangerous shutdowns in the recycling process. When in doubt, throw it out. If you have any additional questions about recycling or solid waste management, both in the Northeast and beyond, feel free to connect with us. You can find this information and much more on our website at nrrarecycles.org. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram at NRRA Recycles. We look forward to hearing from you. This presentation is brought to you with support from a grant thanks to the USDA Rural Utilities Service. For questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.